A cold hand clamps around Nyara's jaw, forcing her wide-eyed gaze upward as the golden chandelier light flickers in Lucien Valsieri's predatory eyes. "You saw the bottle, didn't you?" he whispers, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that silences the ballroom. Behind him, his wife Serafina freezes, her hand clutching her chest in a mask of shock that hides a lethal, sharp-edged panic. The Valsieri Gala is a gilded cage where a single misplaced glance can be a death sentence. To the high society guests, Nyara is a nameless girl in a vest, but to Lucien, she is a loose thread in a tapestry of betrayal. The atmosphere is thick with public humiliation. Every guest watches the lion corner the mouse, unaware that the mouse holds the lion's life in her hands. As Lucien pulls her onto the dance floor, the contrast between his terrifying authority and her visible shock creates a pressure cooker of suspense. The audience is immediately gripped by the mystery. Is he going to kill her, or is he the only one who can keep her alive in a room full of vipers wanting to silence her witness? The music shifted from a sharp, staccato string arrangement to a hauntingly slow waltz, but for Nyara, the air remained thin and suffocating. Lucien's hand was a cold shackle around her waist, while his other hand remained firmly on her chin for a beat too long before sliding down to grip her fingers. He steered her into the center of the marble floor with the practiced grace of a predator, ignoring the audible gasps of the diamond-draped onlookers. To the room, it looked like a scandalous whim of a bored tyrant. To Nyara, it felt like being marched toward a precipice. "Don't look at the crowd, Nyara," Lucien murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration near her ear. He moved her with effortless strength, forcing her feet to follow a rhythm her mind was too terrified to track. "And stop trembling. A woman who sees what you saw shouldn't be shaking. She should be negotiating." Nyara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Valsieri. I was just—" "You were witnessing a murder in the making," he interrupted, his grip tightening as he spun her past a pillar where Serafina stood. His wife's face was a mask of porcelain perfection, but her eyes were twin daggers, tracking their every rotation. The shock in the room was palpable, a heavy fog of judgment and confusion, yet Lucien didn't spare a glance for the woman he had been married to for 20 years. His entire world had narrowed down to the terrified waitress in his arms. "The vial," Lucien prompted, his eyes locking onto hers with a lethal intensity. "The man who handed it to my wife. He was wearing a signet ring with a black onyx stone. You saw his face when the light hit the service entrance. Tell me who he is, and you might live to see the sunrise." Nyara swallowed hard, her throat dry. She could feel Serafina's gaze burning into the back of her neck. "If I tell you, she'll kill me before I even leave this room." "If you don't tell me," Lucien countered, his voice dropping to a chill that made the blood in her veins turn to ice, "you won't even make it to the door." "This isn't a dance, Nyara. It's an interrogation under the bright lights. Every second you stay silent is a second I assume you're part of the plot." He dipped her low, a move so theatrical it drew a smattering of confused applause from the guests who thought this was merely a daring display of power. In that moment of forced intimacy, Nyara saw the true depth of the danger. Lucien wasn't just angry, he was cornered. The great lion of the Valsieri Empire was surrounded by vipers, and he had reached out to the only person in the room who didn't have a motive to lie. "He was tall," Nyara whispered, her voice barely audible over the swell of the violins. "Grey suit." He didn't speak. He just pressed the vial into her palm and whispered, "Midnight." He had a scar running through his left eyebrow. Lucien's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaping in his cheek. The recognition was instant and devastating. He didn't let her go. Instead, he pulled her closer, masking his fury with the facade of a man lost in the music. "Councillor Moretti," Lucien breathed, the name sounding like a curse. "My own shadow." Across the room, Serafina took a step forward, her hand still clutching her chest, her eyebrows arched in a frantic silent demand for an explanation. Lucien ignored her, his eyes remaining fixed on Nyara. "You've just become the most valuable and the most hunted person in this city," he said, his tone shifting from a threat to a dark, protective promise. "The dance is ending, Nyara." When I let go, do not run. If you run, you die. Stay exactly 3 paces behind me. You are no longer a waitress. As the final note of the waltz faded into a tense, expectant silence, Lucien released her hand but kept his gaze anchored to hers. The Ice Queen was already approaching, her silk skirts hissing against the marble like a snake in the grass. Nyara stood frozen, the phantom heat of Lucien's grip still burning on her skin, realizing that the invisibility she had spent years perfecting had just been incinerated. She was no longer a ghost in the Valsieri house. She was the only witness to its crumbling foundation. The sanctuary of the industrial kitchen felt like a slaughterhouse. The frantic clatter of pans and the hiss of steam from the dishwashers provided a dissonant soundtrack to Nyara's spiraling thoughts. She leaned against a stainless steel prep table, her hands shaking so violently she had to grip the cold metal to stay upright. The phantom pressure of Lucien's fingers still burned on her skin, but it was the memory of Serafina's eyes that chilled her to the bone. The heavy double doors swung open with a violent thud. The staff, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, went instantly still, scurrying into the walk-in freezers like rats fleeing a light. Serafina Valsieri glided into the room, her black evening gown trailing across the wet tiles like a spilled ink blot. She didn't belong here amidst the grease and the heat, yet she commanded the space with a terrifying, frigid grace. She stopped inches from Nyara, the scent of expensive jasmine clashing with the smell of scorched garlic. "You have a very pretty face, Nyara," Serafina said, her voice like a silken garrote. "It's a pity it doesn't seem to understand the concept of looking away." Nyara tried to swallow, but her throat felt as though it were filled with glass. "Ma'am, the dance," Mr. Valsieri insisted. "I had no choice. Don't play the victim with me. I know exactly what you are, a girl who thinks a few minutes in a lion's grip makes her a lioness." Serafina reached out, her manicured nails tracing the line of Nyara's jaw, the same spot Lucien had held. Her touch wasn't a caress, it was a measurement. "My husband is a man of many appetites, but his greatest hunger is for information. He thinks you're a witness. I think you're a nuisance that needs to be erased." Serafina reached into her small, beaded clutch and pulled out a check, pre-signed and blank. She snapped it onto the prep table between them. "This is your life, Nyara. Write any number you can imagine. Enough to buy a house in a country where the sun never sets and the Valsieri name is never whispered. Take it and disappear before the gala ends. If you are still on this property in an hour, I will ensure that the accident meant for Lucien happens to you instead. Only yours will be much, much slower." Nyara looked at the check, then back at the woman whose elegance masked a sociopathic rot. She remembered the vial. She remembered the scar on the counselor's eyebrow. If she took the money, she was complicit. If she stayed, she was a target. "The man with the signet ring," Nyara whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp edge. "He didn't look like he was working for Lucien. He looked like he was working for you." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Serafina's mask didn't slip, but her eyes darkened into bottomless voids of malice. She leaned in so close Nyara could see the fine gold flecks in her irises. "In this house, I am the judge, the jury, and the executioner," Serafina hissed. "Lucien is a relic of a dying era. I am the future. You have 60 minutes to decide if you want to be part of the past, buried in a shallow grave beneath the estate, or if you want to be rich enough to forget you ever existed." Serafina turned on her heel, her silk skirts hissing against the floor. At the door she paused, looking back over her shoulder with a sharp, cruel smile. "Choose wisely, little ghost. The Ice Queen doesn't offer warmth twice." As the doors settled into a heavy silence, Nyara looked at the blank check. The temptation to run was a physical ache, a scream in her muscles. But she realized that Serafina wouldn't let a witness live, no matter where she hid. The money wasn't a ticket out. It was a bribe for a silence that would eventually be enforced with a bullet. She didn't touch the check. Instead, she straightened her vest and wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the only person who knew the Queen was planning to kill the king, and for the first time in 3 years, Nyara Wilfred decided she was done hiding. The heavy oak doors of Lucian's private study clicked shut, sealing out the muffled roar of the gala and the predatory scent of Serafina's jasmine. The room was a sanctuary of dark leather, ancient books, and the sharp, clean smell of cedar. Lucian didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, the room was bathed in the amber glow of a single desk lamp and the flickering embers of a dying fire. "Sit," Lucian commanded, his voice no longer the vibrating threat of the ballroom, but something cooler, more clinical. Nyara didn't sit. She stood in the center of the Persian rug, her waitress vest feeling like a target painted on her chest. "She offered me a blank check, Mr. Valsieri. Your wife. She told me I had an hour to disappear or I'd be buried under the rose bushes." Lucian walked to a crystal decanter and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even flinch. He simply turned, leaning back against his mahogany desk, and watched her through the shadows. "And yet, here you are, standing in my inner sanctum instead of sprinting for the service exit. Why?" "Because the man with the onyx ring didn't just give her a vial," Nyara said, her voice gaining a steady, desperate strength. "He told her midnight. I don't think that check was a bribe for my silence. I think it was a timer for my execution. She can't let a witness live, whether I'm in this city or across the ocean." Lucian took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Smart girl. You have the survival instincts of someone who has spent a long time being hunted." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a file, tossing it onto the desk. Nyara stepped forward, her eyes widening as she saw photographs of the counselor with the scarred eyebrow, transcripts of whispered phone calls, and bank statements linked to offshore accounts in Serafina's maiden name. "You knew," she whispered, looking up at him in shock. "You've known about the betrayal this whole time. Why the dance? Why drag me into the center of the floor if you already had the evidence?" "I have the facts, Nyara, but I don't have the leverage," Lucian said, his face hardening into a mask of cold iron. "In the syndicate, a husband moving against a wife without public justification looks like a coup. It looks like instability. I needed a witness who wasn't on my payroll. I needed someone whose shock was genuine, someone whose fear would be recorded by every hidden camera and every gossiping socialite in that ballroom." Nyara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "You used me. You let her see me see the vial so you could justify whatever you're planning to do to her." "I gave you a role in a play you were already cast in," Lucian countered, stepping into her personal space, his height looming over her. "But I didn't expect you to be so observant. You noticed the ring. You heard the timing. You've given me more than a witness. You've given me the window of the strike." He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip, a gesture that was half interrogation, half protection. "Serafina thinks you're a ghost she can blow away with a puff of smoke. She doesn't realize that I've spent 3 years watching you move through my house. I know you're the daughter of a man who knew how to hide secrets in plain sight. I know your father was the one who designed the security for this very room before the accident that took his life." Nyara's breath hitched. The secret she had buried under layers of servitude was laid bare in his eyes. "You're not a waitress, Nyara. You're the one piece of the puzzle Serafina never accounted for," Lucian whispered. He walked to the wall behind his desk and pressed a hidden catch. A panel slid back to reveal a bank of monitors showing every corner of the estate, including the kitchen, where the blank check still sat on the table, and the hallway where Serafina was currently whispering to the counselor with the scarred eyebrow. "Midnight is coming," Lucian said, looking back at her. "The Ice Queen thinks she's turning the thermostat down. We're going to let her believe she's won, right until the moment the floor disappears beneath her. Are you ready to stop being the ghost and start being the blade?" The transition from the velvet shadows of Lucian's office back into the blinding glare of the ballroom felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Nyara moved with the mechanical precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose, her tray balanced on one hand, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. She was no longer a ghost. She was a marked woman carrying a weapon disguised as hospitality. In her pocket sat a small, unmarked crystal vial Lucian had handed her, Not poison, but a colorless, odorless chemical marker. To the naked eye, it looked like water. To Lucien's security team equipped with thermal ultraviolet lenses, it would glow like a neon target. The clock is ticking, Nyara, Lucien's voice echoed in her mind. Mark the serpent, and I'll handle the rest. She spotted her target near the west balcony. Councillor Moretti stood in the center of a small, hushed circle, his scarred eyebrow twitching as he checked his watch. He was deep in conversation with two high-ranking coppos, their heads bent together in a way that screamed sedition. Serafina stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk, her blank check still missing from the kitchen table, a fact Nyara knew was eating at the woman's composure. Nyara took a deep breath, centered her weight, and navigated the crowd. She picked up a fresh bottle of vintage Cabernet from the service station, surreptitiously emptying the marker into the dark liquid. The chemical swirled, invisible and lethal in its own way. Wine, Counselor? Nyara asked, her voice a perfect imitation of a subservient girl who was still trembling from a Mafia boss's whim. Moretti glanced at her, his sneer deepening as he recognized the girl from the dance floor. The master's little pet, he mocked, turning back to his associates. Keep pouring, girl. It's the only thing you're good for. Nyara leaned in, reaching across his shoulder to fill the glass of the man beside him. As the yacht-sized diamond on a nearby guest's hand caught the light, Nyara executed her gambit. She feigned a trip on the hem of her own trousers, her body tilting forward with practiced clumsiness. The heavy bottle slipped. A dark, violent arc of wine splashed across Moretti's grey suit, soaking into the expensive fabric from his shoulder down to his hip. The red liquid looked like a spray of blood against the light wool. You clumsy bitch! Moretti roared, shoving her back. The impact sent Nyara hitting the floor, the tray clattering with a sound that drew every eye in the room. I'm so sorry. Sir, please, Nyara scrambled to her knees, the image of the terrified waitress fully restored. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Lucien standing by the grand staircase. He didn't move, but the slight inclination of his head told her everything. The mark was set. Moretti was fuming, swiping at his chest with a silk napkin, unknowingly spreading the chemical marker deeper into the fibers of his suit. Get her out of my sight before I kill her myself, he hissed at the approaching security. Serafina drifted toward the commotion, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Nyara on the floor. There was a flicker of confusion in the Ice Queen's gaze, a realization that Nyara was still here, still visible, and seemingly more incompetent than ever. She looked at the clock. 20 minutes to midnight. As the guards hauled Nyara to her feet, she caught Lucien's gaze one last time. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the grim satisfaction of a general whose front line had held the breach. Take her to the back, Moretti commanded, his voice trembling with a rage that went beyond a ruined suit. He thought he was disposing of a nuisance. He had no idea he had just been branded for the slaughter. Nyara allowed herself to be led away, her head bowed. The wine on Moretti's suit was already beginning to dry, but the invisible glow was now screaming to the men in the rafters. The gambit was over. The hunt was about to begin. The staff locker room was a stark contrast to the velvet-lined ballroom, a place of dented metal, the smell of industrial soap, and flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with an ominous vibration. Nyara sat on a wooden bench, her breath hitching as she stared at the wine-soaked apron she had just discarded. She knew the clock was at 10 minutes to midnight, but she didn't know that the Ice Queen had already moved her pawn. Earlier, while Nyara had been intentionally spilling wine on the traitor, Serafina had slipped away from the gala's main floor. With a master key and a heart of frost, the Mafia boss's wife had entered the locker room. She hadn't come to talk. She had come to plant a death sentence. The heavy door to the locker room swung open, hitting the wall with a metallic clang. Serafina entered, flanked by two of the family's most brutal enforcers and a crowd of curious, frightened socialites who had followed the scandal from the ballroom. There she is, Serafina said, her voice dripping with a fake, mournful disappointment. The girl my husband so graciously defended. The girl who rewarded that kindness by trying to end his life. Nyara stood up slowly, her back straight, her eyes meeting Serafina's without the flinch the woman expected. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Valsieri. Don't you? My husband grew ill moments after your little accident with the wine. A strange coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Serafina gestured to the head of security. "Search her locker. I suspect we'll find more than just a spare uniform." The enforcer didn't bother with the lock. He used a crowbar, the screech of tearing metal echoing through the small space. He reached into the dark cubby, tossing Nyara's meager belongings onto the floor, a worn jacket, a bus pass, a photo of her father. Then, tucked inside a spare sneaker, he pulled out a small glass vial. A collective gasp went through the high society onlookers. The vial was identical to the one Nyara had seen the counselor hand to Serafina earlier in the evening. "Poison," Serafina whispered, a triumphant gleam dancing in her eyes. "You were the one, Nyara. You took the vial I saw you eyeing at the service entrance and thought you could play at being an assassin. You tried to kill the man who built this house." The enforcers stepped forward, their hands moving toward their holstered weapons. The socialites began to whisper, their sympathy for the clumsy waitress, instantly curdling into a thirst for blood. In the Valsieri world, an attempt on the boss's life was met with immediate, public execution. "I didn't put that there," Nyara said, her voice low and steady. She looked past Serafina to the doorway, where she saw the counselor, still wearing the suit stained with the invisible marker, watching with a smug, satisfied grin. He thought the trap was closed. "Evidence speaks louder than denials, little ghost," Serafina sneered, leaning in close so only Nyara could hear her. "I told you to take the check. Now, you'll take a bullet. And the best part. Lucien will be the one to order it to prove his loyalty to me." "Is that so?" Nyara countered, her lips pulling into a thin, dangerous smile that made Serafina's eyes flicker with a sudden, sharp uncertainty. "Because I think you've forgotten one thing, Serafina. A waitress notices everything, including the fact that your husband's security team has been watching this room on a private feed for the last 20 minutes. Serafina's face didn't just pale, it turned to stone. She spun around just as the heavy thud of leather boots sounded in the hallway. Lucien Valsieri stepped into the locker room, his face an unreadable mask of cold fury. He didn't look at Nyara. He looked straight at the vial in the enforcer's hand, and then at the wife who was holding her breath. "A search was called," Lucien said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "But I think we searched the wrong person first. Before we continue, I'll love to share this with you and I hope it helps. One of the simplest health habits, drinking enough water, is also one of the most overlooked. Many people wait until they feel thirsty before reaching for water, but thirst is actually a late signal from your body that mild dehydration has already begun. Your body is about 60% water, and nearly every system depends on it to function properly. Water helps regulate body temperature, transport nutrients, remove toxins, support digestion, and even maintain brain performance. When you don't drink enough, you may notice symptoms like fatigue, headaches, poor concentration, dry skin, or even mood changes. A powerful tip is to start your morning with a glass of water before coffee or breakfast. After 6 to 8 hours of sleep, your body wakes up dehydrated. Drinking water first helps activate your metabolism, supports digestion, and improves alertness. Another helpful habit is spacing water intake throughout the day instead of drinking large amounts at once. Keep a bottle nearby and take small sips regularly. This allows your body to absorb the water efficiently and keeps hydration levels steady. Most adults benefit from about 2 to 3 liters of water daily, though needs vary depending on climate, physical activity, and diet. Remember, water is not just a drink, it's a daily health tool. Staying consistently hydrated can improve energy, support organ function, and help your body perform at its best every single day. Now back to our story. The locker room felt like a tomb, the silence so heavy it seemed to hum in Nyara's ears. Lucien stood like a monument of dark granite, his shadow stretching across the floor to touch the hem of Serafina's gown. The socialites leaned in, their faces twisted with a voyeuristic hunger for the girl's downfall. Serafina stood tall, her chin tilted in a perfect imitation of righteous fury, pointing at the glass vial the guard held like a smoking gun. "The evidence is right there, Lucien," Serafina said, her voice a crystalline melody of deception. "She had it hidden in her shoe. She was going to kill you tonight. I saved your life." Lucien didn't look at the vial. He looked at Nyara, his eyes searching hers for the signal they had discussed in the shadows of his office. Nyara didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who had just finished a masterclass in sleight of hand. "It's a very convincing vial," Nyara said, her voice echoing with a calmness that made Serafina's eyes flicker. "But it's empty. Isn't it, Mrs. Valsieri?" The enforcer frowned, holding the glass up to the flickering fluorescent light. He shook it. It was dry. Dead air. Serafina's hand went to her chest, her fingers twitching. "She must have used it already. She must have." "I didn't use it," Nyara interrupted, stepping toward the Ice Queen. The guards moved to block her, but a sharp, infinitesimal nod from Lucien made them freeze. "Because I never had it. You see, when you cornered me in the kitchen and offered me that blank check, you were so focused on your threats that you didn't notice how close I was standing. Or how easy it is for a waitress, someone trained to move things without being felt, to reach into an open clutch bag." Serafina's breath hitched. Her hand dropped from her chest to the beaded bag hanging from her wrist. Her movements were frantic now, the porcelain mask of the Mafia wife finally cracking to reveal the panicked conspirator beneath. "You see," Nyara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room, "I knew you'd try to frame me. A woman like you can't help but be predictable. So, while you were busy planting that empty prop in my locker to ensure my execution, I decided to return your property. The real vial. The one with the midnight poison." "You're lying," Serafina hissed, her voice cracking. "Guards, seize her." "Search the bag," Lucien commanded. The words weren't a request, they were an execution order. The head of security, sensing the shift in power, stepped toward Serafina. She recoiled, her back hitting the cold metal of a locker. "Lucien, don't listen to this. This servant. She's trying to destroy us." Lucien reached out, his hand closing around his wife's wrist with a strength that turned her knuckles white. With his other hand, he snatched the beaded clutch away. He didn't hesitate. He turned the bag upside down. A rain of expensive lipstick, a gold compact, and the blank check Nyara had refused hit the floor. And then, with a sharp, crystalline ring, a second vial tumbled out. It wasn't empty. A dark, viscous liquid swirled inside, thick and ominous. The room went deathly silent. Even the socialites drew back, realizing they were no longer watching a scandal, but a sentencing. "Midnight is 5 minutes away, Serafina," Lucien said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He picked up the vial, holding it inches from his wife's face. "You wanted a public search. You wanted a revelation. Well, here it is." He turned his gaze to the counselor, whose onyx signet ring seemed to dim under the harsh lights. The man began to back away toward the door, but the guards, now seeing the glow of the chemical marker on his suit through their specialized lenses, blocked his path with drawn weapons. Nyara stood back, her arms crossed, watching the empire tremble. She had been a ghost for 3 years, a girl who had lost everything to the shadows. But as Lucien handed the poisoned vial to his head of security and turned to look at her with a grim, newfound respect, Nyara realized the trap hadn't just reversed. It had snapped shut. "Take them to the cellar," Lucien ordered, his eyes never leaving Serafina's. "And someone bring Miss Wilfred a glass of my best vintage. She's earned a seat at the table." The chaos of the locker room had been replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness as Lucien led Nyara back into the sanctuary of his study. Outside, the gala continued in a state of muted panic, but inside these soundproofed walls, the world was reduced to the two of them. Lucien sat behind the mahogany desk, the poisoned vial caught in the amber glow of the desk lamp, but his focus was entirely on the woman standing before him. "You handled that with the precision of a professional, Nyara," Lucien said, his voice low and contemplative. Where does a waitress learn to pick a pocket and swap a kill shot under the nose of a Mafia queen? Nyara stood by the fireplace, her silhouette sharp against the fading embers. She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of her server's vest, pulling a thin, soot-covered silver chain from beneath her shirt. Hanging from it wasn't a crucifix or a locket, but a strangely shaped, hand-filed skeleton key. "I didn't learn it in a restaurant, Lucien," she said, her voice dropping into a register that was older, heavier. "I learned it in the crawl spaces of this very estate. I learned it while watching my father, Elias Wilfred, map the mechanical heart of your empire." Lucien's glass stopped halfway to his lips. The name Elias Wilfred was a ghost story in the Valsieri Syndicate. He was the master locksmith and architectural genius who had built the legendary First Vault, the impenetrable safe that sat 3 floors beneath their feet, housing the family's original ledgers and blood money. "Elias died in a construction accident 12 years ago," Lucien stated, though his eyes were narrowing with a sudden, sharp realization. "The crane collapsed near the docks." "It wasn't an accident," Nyara countered, stepping into the light. "My father didn't just build your vault. He built a backdoor. He knew that the moment he finished the project, he became the only man alive who could rob the Valsieris blind. He knew your father wouldn't let him walk away with that knowledge." She walked to the wall behind Lucien, her fingers tracing the hidden seam of the panel that housed the security monitors. With a practiced flick of her wrist, she inserted the skeleton key into a microscopic hole hidden within the wood grain. A soft, pressurized hiss echoed through the room as a secondary compartment slid open, one Lucien hadn't even known existed. "He was erased, because he was too valuable to live," Nyara whispered. "I was 12. I watched from the vents as your father's men took him. I spent the last 3 years working as a waitress in this house not because I was a victim, but because I was waiting for the one person who could help me open the vault he died for." Lucien stood up, his presence looming and dangerous. "You've been a mole in my house for 3 years? Why reveal yourself now? You could have stayed a ghost and eventually found your way down there alone." "Because the back door requires 2 keys," Nyara said, looking him dead in the eye. "One was my father's legacy. The other belongs to the head of the Valsieri house. Serafina was going to kill you tonight, Lucien. If you died, the second key would have passed to her, or to that traitor Moretti. I'm not just a witness to your murder. I'm the only person who can help you reclaim what's inside that vault before the rest of the syndicate realizes the Ice Queen has fallen." Lucien looked at the woman he had treated as a servant, seeing for the first time the iron-willed air of the man who had built his throne. The power dynamic in the room shifted, the air crackling with a new, lethal partnership. "The girl who spills wine and the man who spills blood," Lucien mused, a dark, dangerous smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Your father was the architect of my house, Nyara. It seems only fitting that his daughter helps me burn the traitors out of it." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a heavy gold signet ring, the second key. "The gala isn't over yet. We have a vault to open and a legacy to settle." The descent into the lower levels of the Valsieri estate felt like a journey into the bowels of a fortress. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp stone and old money. In the private summit room, a soundproofed chamber reserved only for the family's highest council, the remaining coupos sat around a heavy mahogany table. Their faces were etched with a mixture of suspicion and greed, sensing the shift in the wind following Serafina's public disgrace. Lucien sat at the head of the table, his presence more imposing than ever in the dim, torch-like flicker of the wall sconces. By his side stood Nyara, no longer the trembling girl from the ballroom, but a silent sentinel in a fresh, sharp uniform. On the table sat a single, dust-covered bottle of 1945 Reserve, the special vintage meant only for the most solemn of Valsieri traditions. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of longevity," Lucien began, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Instead, it has become a lesson in loyalty. My wife and my counselor have already learned that lesson the hard way. Now, it is time for the rest of you to declare where you stand." He looked at Nyara, a subtle nod signaling the start of the ritual. "Miss Wilfred, if you would be so kind. Pour the vintage." The room went deathly silent. Every eye followed Nyara as she uncorked the bottle. The liquid that hit the crystal glasses wasn't the bright red of a typical Cabernet. It was a dark, bruised purple, thick and heavy. As she moved from capo to capo, the tension in the room ratcheted up until it was almost a physical weight. They knew the family legend. The poisoned toast was a test. If Lucien suspected a traitor remained, the bottle was laced. If you drank and lived, your loyalty was proven. If you hesitated, you were guilty. Nyara reached the end of the table, where the youngest capo, a man with nervous eyes and twitching fingers, sat. As she tilted the bottle, a drop of the dark liquid splashed onto the white tablecloth. "You're shaking, girl," the capo hissed, his voice cracking. He looked at the glass, then at Lucien. "Why is a servant pouring the blood of the family? This is an insult." "She isn't just a servant," Lucien countered, leaning forward into the light. "She is the daughter of the man who built this room. She is the witness to every whisper you thought was private. Drink, Lorenzo. Unless you find the vintage unpalatable." Lorenzo stared at the glass. He looked at the other copos, who had already raised their drinks, their faces masks of stone. The sweat beaded on his forehead, reflecting the candlelight. Nyara stood perfectly still, the bottle held with a steady hand. She knew the secret. The wine wasn't poisoned. The poison was the fear in the room. Lucien was watching to see who would break first. "To the future of the Valsieri name," Lucien announced, lifting his own glass. Lorenzo's hand reached for his crystal flute, his fingers trembling so violently the glass clattered against his teeth. He looked at Nyara, seeing the cold, knowing light in her eyes. He saw the daughter of Elias Wilfrid, the man his own father had helped erase a decade ago. Just as the wine touched his lips, Lorenzo slammed the glass down, the crystal shattering and the dark liquid spraying across the table like a fresh wound. "I won't do it. I won't die for a man who trusts a waitress over his own blood." He lunged for the weapon tucked into his waistband, but he was too slow. Before he could clear leather, Lucien's hand was a blur. A heavy silver letter opener, snatched from the table, pinned Lorenzo's hand to the wood with a sickening thud. The youngest capo screamed, his body sagging as the other men stood up, their chairs screeching against the floor. "The toast is finished," Lucien said, his voice calm and terrifying. He looked at Nyara, his eyes dark with a grim satisfaction. "It seems we found the last loose thread. Nyara, take the key. It's time to go below." As the guards dragged the screaming traitor toward the back, Nyara set the bottle down. The tension hadn't just reached a breaking point. It had shattered the hierarchy of the syndicate. She looked at the blood and wine mixing on the table and realized that the special vintage had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had cleared the path to the vault. The descent into the holding cells beneath the estate was a journey into a cold, damp silence that felt more honest than the gilded lies of the ballroom. Lucien led the way, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows against the stone, while Nyara followed, her father's skeleton key clutched tightly in her palm. They reached a heavy iron door where two guards stood at attention, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange light of the wall torches. Inside, Serafina sat on a wooden chair, her black evening gown torn at the hem, her porcelain skin smudged with the soot of her failed coup. She looked up as they entered, her eyes darting to Nyara with a mixture of hatred and a new, sharp-edged desperation. "You think you've won," Serafina spat, her voice raspy from hours of silence. "You think a waitress and a ghost can hold back the tide? Moretti was just the beginning. The syndicate is tired of your old-world honor, Lucien. They want a leader who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty." Lucien stopped inches from her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Moretti is branded. Lorenzo is pinned to a table. Your tide is receding, Serafina. But I'm not here for your philosophy. I want the names of the families who backed you." Serafina let out a cold, hollow laugh. "Names? You'll have to kill me first. And we both know you don't have the stomach to execute your own wife without the council's approval." Lucien's jaw tightened, his restraint beginning to fray. But it was Nyara who stepped forward, moving out of the shadows and into the center of the cell. She didn't look at Lucien. She looked directly at the woman who had tried to frame her for murder. "She's right, Lucien," Nyara said softly. "The council won't care about a poisoned vial that was never drunk. They won't care about a traitor who hasn't spoken. They need a reason to let you break the blood oath of marriage." Nyara reached into the pocket of her vest and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger, a book she had retrieved from the hidden compartment in the study while Lucien was dealing with the Kopos. "My father didn't just build vaults," Nyara told the room. "He built a way to listen. He installed a vibration-sensitive recording system in the walls of the first vault to ensure no one was drilling into it. It's been running for 12 years. And it records every whisper spoken in the master bedroom above it." The Ice Queen's mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Serafina's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she stared at the ledger. "I spent the last hour cross-referencing the dates," Nyara continued, her voice gaining a lethal, calm authority. "I have the dates and times of every meeting you had with the Moretti family. I have the audio of you promising them 40% of the Valsieri shipping docks in exchange for Lucien's head. I have the names of the 4 other families involved in the coup." Serafina collapsed back into the chair, the last of her frigid defiance melting into a puddle of terror. She looked at the book, then at Lucien's face, which had transformed into a mask of absolute, terrifying judgment. "It was the Falcons," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible. "The Falcons and the D'Amicos. They promised me protection. They said you were weak, Lucien. They said you were obsessed with a past that no longer mattered." She began to babble, a torrent of names and dates spilling from her lips as she tried to trade her co-conspirators for a shred of mercy. Lucien's men moved in, pens scratching against paper, recording the confession that would ignite a war across the city's underworld. Lucien turned to Nyara, the grim respect in his eyes now bordering on awe. He had spent a lifetime looking for the rot in his house, never realizing that the daughter of the man who built it was the only one who could hear it breathing. "The evidence is complete," Lucien said, his voice a low bell tolling for the Ice Queen's reign. "Take her away. And prepare the men. We have 5 houses to visit before the sun rises." Nyara stood in the center of the cell, watching as the woman who had called her a nuisance was dragged into the dark. She felt the weight of her father's key in her hand and knew that the final door, the one that led to her true inheritance, was finally ready to be opened. The purge of the Valsieri estate happened with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a winter frost. By the time the first gray streaks of dawn touched the horizon, the sirens had faded, and the heavy iron gates had closed on a world that would never be the same. Serafina was gone, not to a grave, for Lucien knew a quick death was too merciful for a woman who lived for status, but to a nameless exile in a crumbling villa across the sea, stripped of her titles, her diamonds, and the very identity she had used as a weapon. High above the silent driveway, the glass doors of the master suite slid open. Nyara stepped onto the marble balcony, the cold morning air biting at her skin. She was no longer draped in the stiff, polyester vest of a servant or the wine-stained apron of a victim. Instead, she wore a floor-length gown of midnight silk that seemed to absorb the shadows around her, the fabric shimmering like oil on water. Around her neck, the silver skeleton key had been replaced by a single pear-cut black diamond, a gift from the Valsieri vaults that her father had built. The weight of the stone against her chest was a reminder of the power she had spent a lifetime fearing. For years, she had believed that safety lay in being small, in being a ghost that moved through the world without leaving a footprint. But as she gripped the stone railing and looked out over the sprawling city of Seoul, she realized that the shadows weren't meant to hide her, they were meant to obey her. Lucien stepped out behind her, his footsteps silent. He didn't stand over her like a master, nor did he grip her chin in a show of dominance. He stood beside her, a king recognizing his equal. He handed her a flute of champagne, the real vintage, untainted by the theater of a poisoned toast. "The council accepted the evidence," Lucien said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the morning quiet. "The Falcons have retreated, and the D'Amicos are pleading for a sit-down. They know the Ice Queen is gone, but they're more interested in the woman who melted her. Nyara took a sip of the wine, the bubbles sharp and cold against her tongue. They don't know my name yet. They will, Lucien promised. They'll know you as the architect. The one who sees the back doors they think are locked. The one who turned a servant's tray into a throne. Nyara looked down at her hands. They were no longer shaking. The scars from years of labor, the burns from the kitchen, and the memories of her father's accident hadn't disappeared, but they had been forged into something harder. She thought of the terrified girl who had watched from the vents 12 years ago, and for the first time, that girl was at peace. I spent so long trying to stay invisible to survive, Nyara whispered, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. I never realized that the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone ignores. And now? Lucien asked, his eyes reflecting the dark silk of her dress. Nyara turned to him, her chin lifted with the same defiance she had shown when he first gripped her jaw in the ballroom. But now, that defiance was backed by the keys to the kingdom. Now, she said, her voice a calm, lethal promise, I'm done being the ghost. I want them to see me coming. As the sun broke over the horizon, bathing the estate in a fierce golden light, the black diamond of the Valsieri Empire stood tall. The uniform was gone, the fear was dead, and for the first time in her life, Nyara Wilfrid wasn't just living in the house. She owned the foundation it stood on. 1 year later, the Valsieri estate no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like a clockwork masterpiece. The heavy iron gates opened for a black armored sedan, which glided up the drive where Serafina had once stood in faux mourning. Today, the estate was hosting the summit of the 5 families. But the men entering weren't greeted by a line of trembling servants. They were greeted by a security detail that moved with a precision that hinted at a deep, architectural understanding of the grounds. Inside the grand ballroom, the very place where a clumsy waitress had once spilled wine to brand a traitor, Lucien Valsieri stood at the head of a long table. He looked younger, the lethal tension in his shoulders replaced by the ease of a man who no longer had to sleep with one eye open. A hush fell over the room as the double doors at the far end opened. Nyara walked in, her presence commanding a silence that even Lucien's violence never could. She wasn't carrying a tray. She carried a leather portfolio containing the new blueprints for the city's underground infrastructure, a project the city council had approved under her civilian shell company. She took her seat at the right hand of the Valsieri throne. The Coppos from the Falcone and D'Amico families inclined their heads to her first. They had learned the hard way that while Lucien was the fist of the empire, Nyara was its mind. She knew their secrets before they whispered them. She knew the weaknesses of their homes because she had studied the bones of the city itself. Shall we begin? Nyara asked, her voice calm and melodic. As the meeting commenced, she caught Lucien's eye. He offered a small, private smile, the look of a man who had helped a ghost find her body, only to realize she was a goddess all along. The waitress who had once lived in the shadows was gone. In her place sat the black diamond, and as she looked around the room at the most powerful men in the underworld, she knew that not a single one of them would ever dare to call her invisible again. The most powerful lesson from Nyara's journey is that your greatest strength often lies in what the world chooses to ignore. For years, Nyara lived as a ghost, believing her invisibility was merely a survival tactic. In reality, it was her ultimate vantage point. While the elite were blinded by their own shadows and arrogance, she was the only one truly seeing the room. This story is a reminder that being underestimated is not a weakness. It is a strategic advantage. Whether you feel overlooked in your career, your social circle, or your dreams, remember that the waitress in the room often holds the keys to the vault. Stop fearing the power you carry. Step out of the shadows, stop being a witness to your own life, and start being the architect of your destiny. Like the black diamond, you don't need to shout to be the most dangerous and most powerful force in the room. Just make sure that when you finally choose to be seen, you are impossible to forget. Thank you for journeying with us into the shadows of the Valsieri Empire. Your support turns these stories into a community. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay bold. See you again in our next story.